The first issue is whether FPC has violated the international law on the use of force against Draconia. So Article 2, Paragraph 4 of UNSC prohibits all threat to use force as well as the actual use of force. However, it lays down the explicit exception they allow under the Charter. There is exception to the prohibition of use of force under Article 51 of the UN Charter, where the use of force is allowed if it used to self-defend or it used under authorization of armed force by the Security Council. However, there are several requirements need to be satisfied to use force on the self-defense, namely by proving existence of armed attack, proportionality, necessity, and immediacy. So, for the first requirement of armed attack, the state be entitled to respond with force against armed attack, the attack must be considerable gravity. If the attack is not of considerable gravity, then the defending state does not have the right to use armed force in retaliation and therefore must employ peaceful methods. To propose certain gravity by looking at level of intensity, where merely a stream of fire is not sufficient to be categorized as enough to amount to armed attack. In the case USA and Nicaragua military and paramilitary activities, the court stated that the states still have to report and strong evidence of the armed attack to show that they have used a valid use of force on the basis of self-defense against such attack. In oil platform case Iran against US, the ICJ looks at a level of intensity, hence Iranian attack does not amount to the greater form of use of force, so they are not tantamount to the armed attack. Resolution 1368 and Resolution 1373 also acknowledge the right of self-defense against the non-state actors like terrorist groups, where the use of force can be executed as self-defense when there is armed attack in particular scale which have effect in terms of casualty and damage from such group. So, in this present case, the issue arises whether it is justified for the FPC to exercise the right of self-defense by executing the use of force against Ukraine. Pursuant to Article 2, Paragraph 3 and 4 of UN Charter, FPC has a duty to settle the dispute under peaceful means, and it was prohibited to it to use of force against any other party. Nonetheless, as member of UN, FPC can resort the use of force under the exception of self-defense and authority of the Security Council provided under Article 51 of UN Charter. However, as the right of self-defense is not absolute in nature, there are several requirements and elements need to be proved and satisfied by FPC to justify that its full-scale military intervention launched against Ukraine is part of its right of self-defense. For the first condition need to be proved by FPC, use of force must done in response of the armed attack by the states of Ukraine to FPC. By virtue of the fact, Sacrament terrorists who under the warfare support of Ukraine has conducted terrorist attack and exploded a nuclear bomb in the state of FPC. Hence, implying the concept of armed attack in the case of Nicaragua, the Ukrainian attack does amount to an actual armed attack conducted by the regular force as it caused excessive deaths of around 6,000 civilians and declared destruction urban district in FPC. FPC also has right of self-defense from the attack of Sacrament terrorist group as provided in Resolution 1368 and Resolution 1373. Hence, pursuant to the oil platform case Iran and US, as the level of intensity of Draconian and Sacrament attack do amount to grievous form of use of force as they cause the death of civilian and excessive damage, therefore make it eligible to FPC constructed the use of force in response as self-defense to an attack by them against the Ukrainian attacks.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Adriana Suffia and I will proceed to the next point of the presentation. The next requirement is self-defense must be proportionate to the armed attack. This does not mean that it must necessarily be the same. The element of proportionality measures the extent of the use of force against the armed attack. Proportionality simply means that the use of counterforce must be limited to the elimination of the threat and should not exceed the amount of an attack. It implies that the use of force must be limited to the neutralization or abolition of an armed attack against which a state is defending itself. In determining whether the exercise of the right of self-defense is proportionate or not, it depends on the scale and effect of the attack. This is well illustrated in all platform case, where in this case, The whole operation by the United States, which involved in the destruction of 2 Iranian frigates and a number of other naval vessels and aircraft, as well as attacks on Iranian oil platforms, was a response to the mining of a single U.S. warship by an unidentified agency, which was severely damaged but not sunk and without loss of life. It was held by the ICJ that the U.S. failed to establish a lawful exercise of self-defense. It is on the grounds that it failed to discharge the burden of proof that an armed attack existed. The requirement of necessity was not satisfied as the oil platform were not military facilities and thus were not legitimate targets for an armed action in self-defense. Even if Iran was responsible for the supposed armed attack, the scale of the whole operation cannot be considered as proportionate use of the force in self-defense, particularly because the attacks on the oil platform were disproportionate. In the criteria of proportionality of self-defense, the types of weaponry used in response to an armed attack also will be taken into consideration. Nevertheless, it is not requisite for the weapons used in self-defense to be the same as the weapon of attack. In the present case, the other element that needs to be proven by the FPC to justify the use of force on the ground of self-defense is proportionality. The FPC must prove that the self-defense is proportionate to the armed attacks. In measuring the proportionality, the extent of use of force should be taken into account. Referring to the facts of the question, a group of Sacramento terrorists exploded a nuclear bomb carried in a suitcase in a major FPC city. This has resulted in the death of around 6,000 civilians and the destruction of an urban district. Due to this reason, the FPC launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine as an act of self-defense in response to the attacks on the FPC. The use of counterforce by the FPC to eliminate the threat can be said to have exceeded the amount of an attack by the Sacramento. The FPC has launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, and this counterforce is not proportionate if to be compared with the nuclear bomb attack by the Sacramento terrorists. It can be seen that the nuclear bomb attack has caused the death of around 6,000 civilians and destruction of an urban district. On the other hand, the full-scale military invasion by the FPC within 3 days has caused the draconian government and all the members of the Sacramento to have been killed or have fled the country. Applying the platform case to the current issue, based on the scale and effect of the attack, the exercise of the right of self-defense by the FPC is not proportionate. In conclusion, the requirement of proportionality is not proven since self-defense by the FPC is not proportionate to the armed attack by Ukraine to justify the use of force. Next, the elements of necessity under self-defense refers to the measures adopted for self-defense, and these must be necessary to respond to the armed attack. Necessity means that the state did not have any other effective response available to deter the armed attack, except resorting to the use of force. The state claiming the right of self-defense must first establish that there was in fact an armed attack against it. The condition of necessity requires confirmation that the conflict cannot be resolved through peaceful measure. On the basis of proven evidence, it must be assumed that an armed attack is imminent and needs a response. Therefore, in order for the victim state to claim the right of self-defense to be justified, it must have retaliated only through the use of armed force. In the oil platform case, it was held that it is necessary to distinguish the most grave forms of the use of force constituting an armed attack from other less grave forms. Since in the case of individual self-defense, the exercise of this right is subject to the state concerned having been the victim of armed attack. The United States, in this case, must also show that its actions were necessary and proportional to the armed attack made on it, and the platforms were a legitimate military target open to attack in the exercise of self-defense. In the case of legal consequences of the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territory, Advisory Opinion 2004, the issue arises is whether the action of Israel building a wall surrounding the border amount to self-defense. The court was not convinced that the construction of the wall was necessary to attain the Israeli security objective, and that, accordingly, the construction of the wall constituted a breach of humanitarian law. The court concluded that Israel cannot rely on the right of self-defense or on a state of necessity in order to preclude the wrongfulness of the construction of the wall. This case highlights the principle that it is necessary to show that an armed attack is attributable to a state. In the present case, the next requirement for self-defense is necessity. By virtue of the facts of the question, the FPC has adopted the measure for self-defense by launching full-scale military invasion of Draconia in response to the nuclear bomb attack by the Sacrament terrorists. In this regard, the FPC must prove that the state has no other effective response to deter the armed attack except resorting to the use of force. In claiming the right of self-defense, the FPC must prove that there is an armed attack against it, and it must be confirmed that the conflict cannot be resolved through a peaceful measure. The nuclear bomb attack by the Sacrament terrorists can be said to be imminent and needs of response, as it has caused the death of around 6,000 civilians and the destruction of an urban district of the FPC. Hence, the FPC must retaliate only through the use of armed force. Applying the all-platform case, it must be proven that the use of force by the FPC through the full-scale military invasion of Draconia were necessary and proportional to the armed attack made on it. Next, applying the case of legal consequences of the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territory Advisory Opinion 2004, it is necessary for the FPC to show that an armed attack is attributable to its states by Draconia. In conclusion, the requirement of necessity for self-defense is proven to justify the use of force by the FPC against Draconia.
So I'm going to present on immediacy. Immediacy means that response to an armed attack needs to be instant. So the theory of immediacy, however, cannot be explicitly clarified since it can take some time for the state official to decide in order to respond to an armed attack. So therefore, the use of force can still be lawful if the delay has been objectively justified. So based on the Caroline incident, term immediacy has given rise to a situation wherein armed attack necessitates self-defense instead of overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. So if a small-scale armed attack occurs, the response by the victim state must be immediate, otherwise the requirement of immediacy will not be fulfilled, and the use of armed force will be amount to an unlawful reprisal. So, applying the above law, immediacy is part of the element of necessity that will have to be proven, justifying the use of force by FPC against Draconia. So with that, the action taken by FPC must be reflected based on the Caroline incident in which the term immediacy has given rise to a situation wherein armed attack necessitates self-defense instead of overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. So based on the present fact, considering the scale of the attack towards the FPC is a huge attack that has caused great losses and damages, the FPC has launched their military attack after 1 week of the nuclear explosion deemed to be reasonably justified. Therefore, the use of force can still be lawful, even there is a delay provided that it has been objectively justified. In the present issue, since there is no fact stated that on the reason FPC took 1 week after the explosion and attack take place to launch a full-scale military on Draconia, assumption can be made based on the fact that FPC has been attacked given no time to FPC to make an official preparation. Hence, the delay of 1 week to launch a full-scale military attack is justifiable provided that it is a reasonable delay as a means to identify the Sacrament movement and attack. In that sense, inferring that the FPC will need to identify their needs to be gathered or intelligence and military force of the state. Therefore, there needs to be given appropriate order to strike back in a targeted manner. So in that sense, relying to the Falkland conflict, where the UK retained the right of self-defense for a period of time after the initial attack by Argentina and the ensuing occupation of the island. However, in this instance, although the initial armed attack had ceased, the military occupation of the territory amounted to a continuous armed attack which justified the use of self-defense. So reflecting the incident of Falkland to the facts given, the continuous attack by the Sacrament with the support of Draconia deemed the delay to be a reasonable delay, justifying the attack on Draconia. Next, I'm going to explain on the report to the Security Council. So, according to the Article 51 of the UN Charter, requires that any action taken in self-defense by a member state to be immediately reported to Security Council. So, this provision has been mentioned to the Charter so that the international community can evaluate whether an armed attack has occurred or not. So, and further evaluate if the action taken by the victim state in self-defense has met the element like necessities, proportionality, and immediacy or not. So, with that, accordingly, the right of self-defense can only be exercised until the Security Council has taken
measure necessary to maintain the international peace and security. So during the period, the victim state must stop its action in self-defense as soon as the Security Council takes the measure necessary. So reporting to the Security Council is a completely new concept that did not have any roots in the customary international law. So I'm referring to the case of USA and Nicaragua military, where the court had mentioned that it is vital for the victim state to report that it has acted in self-defense to the Security Council in order to legitimately justify its use of force. So on that basis, reporting to the Security Council will stand as measure that taken in self-defense provided that any action shall be immediately reported to the Security Council. This has been reflected in this case wherein a state could not invoke the right of self-defense if it failed to comply with the requirement of reporting to Security Council. So applying this to the situation, the requirement addressed under Article 51 of the UN Charter that requires any action taken in self-defense by a member state to be immediately reported to the Security Council. So here, in the present case, we can illustrate that by launching the full scale of military invasion, so the Security Council are aware of the attack during that there was an emergency meeting of the Security Council. However, based on the fact given, they was unable to decide on any action against Draconia or the sacrament due to the single negative vote cast by a permanent member. So, with that, when the FPC president publicly claimed that his state was exercising its inherent right of individual and collective self-defense in response to the attack on the FPC at Fantasia and notified the Security Council of the steps taken by the FPC, it is justified based on the delay on part of the Security Council in taking necessary means to evaluate the armed attack on FPC as a means to maintain national peace and security. So, applying to the case of Nicaragua, the principle in the Nicaragua case where it is applicable provided that the court had mentioned that it is vital for the victim state to report that it has acted in self-defense to the Security Council in order to legitimately justify its use of force. So on that basis, reporting to Security Council will stand as measure taken in self-defense provided that any action shall be immediately reported to the Security Council. So it has been reflected in this case wherein a state could not invoke the right of self-defense if it failed to comply with the requirement of reporting to the Security Council. So, we can infer that considering the report has been made to the Security Council in accordance with the requirement of Article 51 and relying to the case of Nicaragua, FPC has fulfilled the requirement to report to the Security Council when the FPC notified the Security Council on their steps taken. So, to conclude, considering that the FPC has failed on the element of proportionality when invading Laconia, this of force has means for self-defense is not justified.
So the second issue is whether FPC carries the right of collective self-defense over its military invention against Draconia. When a state is subjected to armed attack but state is incapable to respond to the armed attack, so the state may extend its invitation to another state to help the state to counter the armed attack committed by another state. However, there are several requirements need to be satisfied. The first requirement is there must be an armed attack. In Nicaragua case, the court looked at the argument put forward by the US, where they insisted that the contract to use force against Nicaragua. The use of force is necessary and justified on the basis of defense. The government in Nicaragua was assisting the armed rebel movement in territory of El Salvador to attack the government of El Salvador. The US argued that this invitation justified them to use force against Nicaragua via the contrast. The court held that there is no evidence the existence or the invitation of alleged to be committed by the government of Nicaragua amounts to armed attack, so this argument is not justifiable. Next, the second requirement is the state, which is the victim of the armed attack, must inform and declare their view it has been attacked. And third requirement is there must be a request by the state that regard itself as the victim of the armed attack. In Nicaragua case, the court extended and contended that there was no direct evidence this country had made formal invitation for the US to help them counterattack by the Nicaragua. On the other hand, in the case of invasion of Kuwait, has fulfilled this requirement where it was held that US and its allies were allowed to help Kuwait to free themselves from invasion of Iraq. This is because it was proven that Kuwait was subjected to armed attack by Iran and it made a formal declaration it was subjected to armed attack. Kuwait also made a formal invitation to states to help it and free itself from invasion of Iraq. So in apply to our present case, FPC claims that the military invasion towards the Crimea is part of collective self-defense, governed under Article 55 of the UN Charter. This claim, however, is allowed if FPC is able to prove that it has fulfilled and exercised all the requirements to risk collective self-defense. Firstly, there must be a armed attack that made FPC in response to use the force against such attack. Pursuant to the Nicaragua case, as discussed before, there is an attack before the Crimea. FPC was also able to prove that the Crimea Air Force had executed an attack on numerous targets inside Fantasia territory, resulting in the deaths of over 2,000 Fantasia nationals. Next, by virtue of the fact in this case, FPC also has specified second requirement in declaring that it is an attack when FPC president publicly announced that his state was exercising inherent right of individual and collective self-defense in response to the attack on the FPC and Fantasia. However, in regard of the state requirement on the request of victims from other states to help them as a victim of an attack, nothing in the fact of our case can prove that either FPC or Fantasia has made formal invitation to other states to help them. Thus, by default from the case of Kuwait, the exercise of collective self-defense in this present case is prohibited under the rule of international law. In conclusion, FPC cannot use collective self-defense to validate illegal military invasion against Draconia.